We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! Part 9 of What If Naruto Died and Reincarnated as an Uchiha. Death has a funny way of coming back to bite you when you least expect it. Having lost the fourth shinobi war, Uzumaki Naruto is content to do just that, die and pass on to the afterlife. Unfortunately, the Shinigami has other plans for him. Plans that involve righting the wrongs of the past, restoring a broken clan, and creating a family all his own. NarutoxHarem. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 17, Reckoning. I'm losing myself. Having gone through the last few entries in this old journal of mine, I've come to that conclusion. I gaze upon these tattered pages and I feel nothing for them. No regret. No remorse. Only cold cynicism. Where did the hope go? When did I stop caring for anything more than the outcome? Where did I become cold? When did I turn cruel? Where did I state to value Konoha's existence over that of the other villages of the world itself? I don't know. I can't even see where it started. Did it begin when the Shinigami pulled me from the afterlife? Or was it slower than that? More insidious? Subtle? I fear the latter, and that terrifies me. My memories are my only recourse in this, but even they've begun to get fuzzy as of late. Kaguya-an isn't that another can of worms, assures me I have nothing to fear. She swears she won't let me lose myself, but even so, the fear is still there. My hair has gone white. The color of ash. Even my eyebrows match it now. I don't understand what caused it. The shock, trauma, or something more sinister. Am I still myself? Am I Madara? Am I Kaguya? Am I Naruto? Some strange hybrid of the three? Gods above, am I even me anymore? I don't think I have many entries left in me. Gods, what am I becoming? Open the gates. At the sentry's shout, the great green doors of Konoha opened. With a ponderous groan the steel-shod barriers parted in either directions as the crank turned, revealing the village beyond. For Naruto, it felt like an eternity until he could finally glimpse his old home. Faint shards of reluctant morning sunlight peeked through the growing gaps, drawing a muffled yawn from the slumbering babe nestled his arms. Mercifully, little Kuratsuchi he'd begun to suspect it was her didn't raise a fuss, nor did the guards deny him entry because of her presence. A few glanced at the child as he passed, but none proved foolish enough to challenge him for her. Good. Regardless of their thoughts, the time-traveling terror was quietly chuffed by the distinct absence of a crowd. The last time he'd come home, it had been to a teeming mass of civilians. This time around, only a handful of shinobi had gathered to greet his return, and of their number many appeared reluctant to approach. Almost as if they were afraid of him. It made a twisted sort of sense, really. He could have outrun the news perhaps, if he had been so inclined, but he hadn't. Hadn't been in his right mind, either. Instead he'd taken a long and meandering path back to the village at top speed, arriving long afterward. Iwa was gone and he'd been the one to do the deed, damning them all. It remained to be seen what exactly the world knew of his fall. Well, damn. I wonder what they think of me. Many things, none of them good. Naruto didn't need Kaguya's words. He could sense it. Like a shroud of palpable unease, so too did he find himself able to see the concern in the villagers, taste their anxiety roiling in the air. Fear. They were afraid of him, and the realization rocked his world to the core. This went well beyond anything he could gauge even with his eyes active, or his cloak. Not quite mind-reading, he could just feel them. It wasn't something he could explain, let alone lend words to. Something had changed in him during his last rampage. Everything was raw and he couldn't find a way to shut it off. Part of him wasn't sure he wanted to. That raised all manner of red flags. Yet another thing to worry about. Damn, but it never ended, did it? If he wasn't fighting armies or deposing tyrants, he was fighting himself for control of his own body. Even now he could feel the horns beneath his skin, those red spires lurking just beneath the surface. Stop! Kaguya snapped at him, her harsh words cutting through the fog of his panic, bringing with them a blessed sense of numbness. Breathe! Startled, Naruto exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The world spun back into focus and he found himself detached from it all, separated from the sea of heightened emotions he'd been privy to mere moments before. It was not something he ever wished to experience again. Everything was fraying, breaking, and he had to rein it in despite the pain. The alternative was unacceptable. Steeling himself, the whiskered warrior shook his head mightily and straightened up. There. He felt a ghostly hand graze his shoulder. Anxiety's only going to make it worse, you know. Remember what I told you. Calm yourself. Naruto groaned. Kill me now. Never. The lightest tap between his shoulders spurred him forward to meet his fate. Spirits, this was going to cause problems for him. You couldn't inspire the masses when they were afraid to speak your name. There would be questions of course and he'd have to answer them whether he wanted to or not. He could already feel the beginnings of a migraine coming on. Though he wanted nothing more than to go home and fall into bed, it seemed that was no longer an option. A flicker of motion in the corner of his vision informed him that one of the nearby Umbu had finally mustered up the nerve to approach. Several, in fact. Well, this boded poorly. Uchiha Naruto. Their bull-masked leader intoned solemnly, stopping just out of arm's reach. The Hokage wishes to speak with you. Where's my family? Much like the man's namesake, the ninja buelled past him, his sandals kicking up dust. I need to see them. He barely made it 3 steps before he found himself facing a wall of Umbu. With all due respect sir, their leader replied, I can't allow that. Naruto stopped cold. I should kill you. All of you. Wait, where had that thought come from? It took a physical effort on his part to maintain his smile in the face of the captain's ire. More so for him to will his muscles to relax. Look, I know the old man wants to see me, but as you can see, I'm a bit busy. A hand clamped down on his wrist like an iron vice, denying him passage. He was most insistent, sir. You can leave the infant with us. Even as the man spoke, he attempted to reach for her. No, I really wouldn't. Little Kuratsuchi chose that moment to discharge the contents of her breakfast onto the man's mask in spectacular fashion. Baby formula wasn't easy to come by when you were out in the wilds. Thankfully, he'd had the next best thing. To be fair, he wasn't sure how he felt about feeding her from the teat of a woman who claimed to be a living goddess, but in this moment he knew exactly how the captain felt. Nothing like a bit of spit-up to ruin your day. Better yet, the babe was actually smiling. Somehow, the sight of it lightened his spirits. This time, his smile wasn't forced at all. On second thought. Let's go. Have you taken leave of your senses? Sarutobi's anger was to be expected, taken for granted, even. Naruto didn't flinch as his clenched fist crashed down on the desk, nor did the mewling babe in his arms. He'd known the old man's wrath was coming. From the moment he'd ripped Inoki's soul from his body and ground Iwa to dust he had expected it. By the time he'd been escorted to the man's office he was more than prepared. Ah, and there it was now, as the old geezer leaned back in his chair. The exhausted sigh. That look of silent disappointment bordering on scorn. He'd been on the receiving end of that look far too many times to count in the past. It almost felt like another life now. It did nothing to quench his anger. He didn't need the third to tell him how badly he'd screwed the pooch on this one. The guilt was something a part of him already. He knew. He'd agonized over it during the days it took him to trek back. Every minute of every day had been spent wondering how he could have done things differently, and while he hadn't quite come to terms with what he'd done, he knew tearing himself apart benefited no one but the enemy. Right now, he needed to explain himself lest he risk being thrown into a cell. Or worse. In the end he swallowed his spite, straightened up, and said the only thing he could think to say. Not so loud. Pardon. I said, don't be so loud. You're going to make Kuratsuchi cry. Sarutobi's gaze flicked to the babe in his arms and his gaze softened. You had to know him to see it, and Naruto knew him very well. He could see it in the way his eyes creased, the slightest hint of hesitation as he laid his gaze on those tiny dark orbs. He'd always had a soft spot for children. Kuratsuchi was no exception. Rising from his desk, the weary Kage approached. If she was at all afraid of him, Kuratsuchi did little to show it. After all, she was far too focused on tugging at Naruto's vest. After a moment's thought, Hiruzen patted her head and returned his gaze to the ninja in question. I was wondering why you brought her here. He rumbled. A survivor? The last. Naruto relented reluctantly. I aim to take care of her. I see. Have one of your clones take her outside, for now. It took him a handful of seconds to realize it wasn't a request. As the door eased shut behind his doppelganger, Hiruzen returned to his desk and fixed Naruto with a state of pure steel. Tell me what happened. Ah, and now they came down to it. I was captured and forced to fight my way out. Not a lie. He had surrendered and been captured because of it. I didn't have much room to improvise. No one lived to contradict him, and he wasn't about to submit to a Yamenka probe, though they both knew such an attempt would prove fruitless. It still didn't justify what he'd done. They both knew that. This went well beyond a simple reprimand. One way or another he was going to be punished for this, no matter what he said. But that didn't mean he had to go down quietly. Your mission was to assassinate that Tsuade. Hiruzen repeated flatly, his voice sparking like flint. Not summon a dragon to devour the souls of innocent women and children. Surely you could have escaped without slaughtering them all. Naruto stiffened. How did he know that? The dawn broke and suspicion came rushing in. Was it that crystal ball of his? Damn, I can't remember its range. My summons may have been too enthusiastic. Naruto countered, grimacing at the mention of Aljuin. If I could go back and do it over, I'd spare them. That may well be, Hiruzen steepled his fingers sternly, but you cannot take back what you've done. Something black inside of Naruto bristled at the subtle insinuation lurking behind those words. Hey, he growled, you were the one that sent me into that hot zone. We didn't even try. Need I remind you that you accepted this mission, Naruto? The Sandaime interjected sternly, silencing him. You were the one who chose this. The consequences fall upon you. You can't possibly wipe a village off the map and expect to escape the consequences. We can't afford to set an example like this, let alone that kind of a precedent. It's too dangerous. The other nations are already unilaterally condemning your actions. Even our allies can't stomach what you've done. Within his subconscious, Kagaya sucked in an angry breath. So that's how it is. Wait, what? I'm sorry, Naruto, I truly am, but I'm afraid you've left me no choice. As if sensing the unspoken question, the aging Kage barreled onwards. For your crimes against humanity, I hereby strip you of all rank and privilege within the village and place you under arrest, effective immediately. Into the stunned silence, he charged ahead. Your squad will be reassigned to another Jonin after they return from their present mission to the border. Due to your exemplary service prior to this, you will be given a trial. Naruto didn't hear the rest. The rest of the words faded away into an endless animal bleat, eclipsed only by the pounding of his pulse. Darkness pressed around the corners of his vision and all the color faded from the world, replaced by muted gray. Words escaped him and his mind rejected it so wholly he refused to accept the reality of this betrayal. A dream. This had to be a bad dream. Instead of arguing his side of the story, he'd be thrown in irons. His triumphant return replaced by a cold cell. And while he languished there, Madara would roam free, using his pawns. The world would go on, and everything would end once again. A spark of anger ignited deep in his chest, fanning the flames of rebellion. After all he'd done, this was how they repaid him. His hands trembled. I don't even. What justice was this? His next words were a whisper. Is that why the Umbu are waiting outside? Pity. He hated the pity in those eyes, turned away from it. People are afraid. What you did, Naruto, it was monstrous. They need time to adjust. While I rot in a cell. He challenged. You'll only remain there until the council reaches a verdict. Sarutobi argued. If they find you innocent, you're kidding me, right? Naruto physically recoiled from the statement, genuinely surprised by how much the old man had hurt him with what he doubtlessly believed to be a righteous action. So that's how it is. I carried out my duties without question. I fought to keep the village safe. I shed blood and tears on the battlefield with my fellow shinobi. I mourned them when they died. Then I make one mistake, one error, a few villagers piss and moan about it, and suddenly I'm a fucking scapegoat? And you expect me to accept this? Perhaps Hiruzen recognized his poor choice of words then, perhaps not. Regardless, he found himself unable to predict what came next. You, hypocrite. Hiruzen blinked in disbelief. Excuse me, you heard me. Naruto snarled, rounding on the man he'd once seen as a grandfather with a vicious hiss. Spare me the lies and inequities. I'm a fucking scapegoat. That's what I am to the world, isn't it? The Black Death. Reaper of the innocent. Is that what they're calling me now? An oath breaker, because I broke one of their so-called vows. So many vows. Hissing in anger, he swung his fist against the wall, cratering it with a single swing. They make you swear and swear. Defend your Kage. Obey your lord. Keep his secrets. Do his bidding. Your life for his, but obey your clan. Love your family, protect the innocent. Defend the weak. Respect the gods. Obey the laws. Palming his face, the warrior shook his head, a grim scowl etching itself across his face. It's too much. No matter what you do, you're forsaking one vow or the other. Fuck that. You said it yourself, didn't ya? I'm a monster. Perhaps the people should speak more softly to me then, because these days the enemies of this monster are dropping like flies. Panting through his explosive rant, he turned burning eyes on his old friend. Choose your next words carefully, Naruto. Sarutobi warned, his voice echoing into the silence. I may be a man of peace, but I will not tolerate disrespect. Neither will I. The Uchiha snapped back, baring his teeth in a snarl. I won't allow you to toss me in a cell with, he swallowed, nearly mentioning Madara before stopping himself, a bloody war on. I'm needed here. He could have thrown more than a dozen arguments at the old man, but realized only one stood any chance of changing his mind. The answer was obvious. I have to stop. Sarutobi glanced at him askance. I'm afraid I don't understand what you're saying. Of course you don't. Once more Naruto's temper slipped its leash, to which he brought a clenched fist crashing down on the table. Don't you get it? For the sake of argument, let's say I do as you ask. Throw myself into a cell and wait for judgment. Then what? The war keeps going, more innocents die, and for what? Because your best weapon's rotting in a cell just to satisfy your enemies. Yes, enemies, old man. Because they're the only ones who benefit from this. So go ahead. Alienate me, let it all go to hell. If I'm guilty, I'll stay in prison for the rest of my days. But let's say I'm deemed innocent instead. All good, right? He paused for effect, letting the weight of his proposal sink in. Wrong. See, I have a very, very, very good memory. The Uchiha continued quietly, leaning forward over the desk to make his point known. Downright scary, really. By the time I finally get out of that cell, be it weeks, months, years, or even decades later, it'll still be there. The memory of how I was thrown away as a political puppet to satisfy the whims of our enemies. What do I fight for then? I'd cease to care about those around me, take on more and more dangerous tasks, all in the hope that I'm following the right path. I take out leader after leader, annihilating whomever dares stand against me, the village, us. Eventually I get promoted and command others to do the same. Round and around it goes. Why? What gives me the right to make decisions like that? Nothing. No, if we start to believe we know what's best for everyone, if I allow myself to think that this path is the only path, then I'll become him. Become who? My ancestor. He leaned back and away, all the while lying through his teeth. I refuse to become him. I'll become a weapon, a tool, a knife in the dark if I have to, but I'll never become that. Neither will I be a dupe. I've been down that road once before. Never again. I'm not some sacrifice for you to tend your precious will of fire. As a matter of fact. I'm out. His piece said, the former blonde spun on his heel, turned his back and marched away. Where are you going? Sarutobi's voice called at his back. I haven't given you permission to leave. Damn it. Naruto paused and exhaled a mighty sigh. He turned to face the third, even as his palm wrapped around the door with enough force to buckle the handle. Spirits, he felt old. He'd never thought he'd see the day when he threatened the old man. Never in all his years. It made him feel hollow inside, as if he'd just betrayed someone most dear. He regretted killing those people. More than anything else. If it had been within his power to see them brought back, he would. But they hadn't just been killed, their souls were devoured. Destroyed. There was nothing to return. Scorn reared its ugly head and he shook it off. Where am I going? He retorted with a dry look at the man he'd once respected above all else, I'm going home. I'm going to find my partner and fuck her into oblivion. I'm going to hold my son. Then I'm going to talk to my clan, take a long nap, and pretend this conversation never happened. Maybe you should, too. Let the dead rest. Better for both of us that way. To his credit, the old man didn't show so much as a flicker of killer intent. He didn't have to. Naruto, he began slowly, rising from his desk, are you threatening me? No. It's not a threat. Then what is it? A promise. For a moment, he thought Hiruzen might actually call for the guards or worse, attempt to restrain him outright. His words bordered on treason and he just defied a direct order from his superior. The third would be well within his rights to do so. Could he fight the old man? Naruto wasn't certain, for he had no desire to do so. But he wasn't willing to let himself be raked over hot coals, either. It seems we're at an impasse, then. You can try to detain me if you like. The exhausted Uchiha relented, a lone Sharingan peering over his smoldering shoulder. But I promise you I won't go quietly and you'll pay for it. Dearly. With blood. Buckets of it. But hey, he rolled his shoulders in a shrug, who knows? You could succeed. Orochimaru and Tsunade are still in the village. You might stand a chance with them at your back. Then again, you might not. Regardless, I don't want to fight you. My loyalty is to the village. Always has been, always will be. I'll gladly place myself under house arrest until you get the villagers in order, but nothing more. My guilt's more punishment than you could ever know. The man I knew would understand that. This time, no one challenged him when he departed. Retrieving Kuratsuchi from his shadow clone, Naruto found none of the Umbu barred his presence this time around. A few followed him with their faceless masks when he stormed towards the exit, but whatever doubts or contemptuous thoughts they held for him remained hidden behind the porcelain facades. Good. He'd had enough scorn for one day. Any more of this and he might lose his temper and clobber someone. Who knew where that would lead? No, he chastised himself, he needed to hide, get out of the public eye for now. Sarutobi was right in that aspect at least. Right, then. No more drama. Just get home. Upon reaching the door leading to the street, the whitehead flung it open with his free arm. In that moment, his sole thought was to spirit himself away and wait for the storm to blow over. It never once occurred to him to feel sorry for what he'd said or done. He'd spoken true from his heart and consequences be damned. For all his problems and obstacles that much hadn't changed. His resolve, though briefly shaken by what he'd faced here today, remained firm. He would save the world from Madara's machinations. One way or another. Even if he had to drag it kicking and screaming. You get points for determination, if nothing else. Kagaya purred. Oh, stuff it. To his surprise, he wasn't alone. Scarce had he stepped out of the Hokage building than he found the way shut to him, for a sizable crowd had gathered outside the tower to greet his return. Well, this boded poorly. Naruto nearly bristled on sheer instinct before he realized he recognized some of them. He might not know each of them by name, but it was impossible to miss the distinct features of the Uchiha clan. Much to his confusion, a smattering of Hyuga stood among them as well. Hoshi and Mikoto's doing, no doubt. Speaking of which, where were Mikoto emerged from the throng of shinobi first, little Itachi cradled in her arms. Judging by the bedraggled state of her hair and her rumpled blue dress, she must have woken only minutes before. Hoshi appeared to be in slightly less dire straits where appearance was concerned, or perhaps she'd recently returned from a mission. Regardless, it was unusual indeed to see her clad in her shinobi fatigues. Not a bad look for her. If she was at all perturbed by the sight of the infant in his arms, she did little to show it, thankfully. You look terrible. Mikoto sighed, crossing the distance between them in a few quick strides, her dark eyes scrutinizing. What happened to your hair? Gee, thanks ever so much. Despite himself, Naruto couldn't find it in him to scowl. Less so when he saw Itachi. Spirits, he was growing fast. Just the sight of his son now wasn't that a thought wiped the tension from his mind like a cleansing tide. Carefully, he reached down to pat the babe's tiny head. Hey there, kiddo. The little boy squealed happily. Duh. Did he just say dad? Mikoto actually laughed at that. He's a quick learner. I heard what happened and gathered everyone as soon as we could. His bride-to-be soothed, caressing his cheek. For what it's worth, the Uchiha clan is with you. Naruto nearly choked on his own spit. Hey, now. I'm not trying to start a rebellion or anything. All of you, just go home, will ya? No, absolutely not. That was one flag he intended to avoid at all costs. Everything worked out in the end. I'm just, on leave for a... Kuratsuchi chose that moment to coo softly. Mikoto's gaze shifted instantly. Naruto. Oh. Why yes, dear. You're holding a baby. Care to explain? Now wait a sec. I can explain. She's not mine. Well, she is, but I didn't. Oh, please do. Mikoto was trying very hard to be patient. She was also failing spectacularly. Perhaps you should start from the beginning. Hoshi offered. Just like that, the migraine reasserted itself with a groan. Bit of a long story, that. Near the border of the land of fire, Kushina was going to die. She felt it in every breath, feared it in every step. Her lungs were on fire, begging for relief she couldn't afford to give. If she stopped even for a moment she'd be caught. If she was caught she'd meet the same fate as her teammates. Vanished, seemingly plucked from the very air itself. She had no way of knowing if they were dead or alive, only that she must run. Fighting meant certain death now. She'd seen what happened to their missed escort when they stood their ground. Their screams still echoed in her ears. No matter how far she ran, she still heard them. Worse, she'd lost her kunai. Still, she spurred herself on. Ibiki. Nawaki. No one knew. Fear spurred Kushina's leaden legs forward even as exhaustion took its toll, darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. She was drawing almost exclusively from her tenant's power now, pulling as much chakra as she dared without risking her sanity. Even then she feared she wasn't nearly fast enough, though all her world was a blur and though she flung herself through the trees with ever-increasing speed, she still hadn't been able to shake her pursuer. Her heightened senses told her they were still in hot pursuit. What the hell? She ground out through gritted teeth. Who is this guy? Where had it all gone wrong? Impossible to tell. Everything was falling apart, their mission was a failure. No, perhaps it had been one from the very beginning. The ambush had been too perfect. Too well executed. As if the enemy knew exactly where they would be. They'd struck just after dawn, when they were at their most unprepared. That implied a traitor within their ranks, but who? None of that mattered now, she just had to get back to. The arm came out of nowhere. One moment she was soaring through the trees with wild abandon, the next a limb closed around her neck from behind, slamming her face first into the ground. Bucking against her attacker, Kushina slammed her head back with all her might and was rewarded with an annoyed grunt. Nothing more. All her strength drained away a heartbeat later, sucked up into some unseen sieve. Damn it, no. With a feral snarl she pulled more of the fox's chakra to her arms and legs only to find that two had been denied her. Even then she fought on, until a hand closed around her mouth and pressed a foul-smelling cloth to her face. Eyes rolling, her world spinning, she managed to catch a glimpse of her attacker. An orange mask filled her vision, a lone eye staring out at her from within. As she passed out, the masked man tilted his head, giggling madly. Sleep well, little fox. Chapter 18, Peace is a Lie, Interlude. Isn't it though, journal? I'm ashamed to admit I've actually started to question the concept of peace. You just can't have it. Somewhere, someway, somehow, there will be some form of conflict. There will always be provocateurs, those who would rather see the world burn than suffer the mantle of peace upon their shoulders. You can't stop them all, and you certainly can't control everything else. To think otherwise would be naive. A perfect world? A peaceful world? Impossible. We all have misunderstandings, we all suffer through hardship in one way or another. The best you can do is maintain the balance while you're alive. Dance on that razor-thin line between sanity and oblivion. After that? Who knows? Needless to say my actions in IWA had repercussions. I lost track of time after that. Consigning oneself to house arrest sounds easy enough on the label, actually enacting it, well now, that's another matter entirely. You don't really appreciate freedom until you've lost it. To lose something you've never been without, to find your entire world suddenly compressed to a mere 4 walls and a roof, it's stifling to say the least. Family and friends dull the pain, can even help you pull through at the best of times, but in the end it's up to you. Granted, locking yourself up in your own home is far better than someone locking you in a cell and throwing away the key, but I digress. It feels like weeks. In reality, it's been all of 2 days trapped beneath my own roof before I went stark raving mad. Still, can you blame me? Think on this for a moment. You made a mistake, a terrible, horrible mistake, one you have no idea to correct. Said mistake results in your indefinite imprisonment. All the while you're forced to live with the knowledge that your arch-nemesis is still out there besmirching your name, still stirring up trouble, still trying to tear the world down around your ears. Knowing that, it threatened to drive me over the edge. In truth, I was ready to be done with it. I'd long since lost track of time and with it, any semblance of hope. I was ready to make an end of things, to find that damnable prick, rip him out of whatever hole he was hiding in and lop off his head. But now I can't, and I only have myself to blame. It's like knowing you have a roach infestation, yet you can't find their bloody nest. Instead of being allowed to take the fight to the enemy. Oh, what fresh hell is this? Naruto frowned at the vision of resplendent beauty looming over him. Strands of ashen hair wafted across his face to tickle his nose, bringing with them a faint scent he couldn't quite recognize. Milky white eyes gazed down into his own with quiet curiosity. In that moment he became keenly aware of a gentle weight pressing against his hips alongside a pair of pale hands resting gently against his collarbone. That didn't bother him. What concerned him was the owner of said eyes. On a certain level he knew he should be alarmed, startled even, but when faced with that placid expression he simply couldn't muster up the energy. All that emerged was a soft sigh into the blank, empty white expanse of the horizon. This is a dream, isn't it? He muttered, frowning up at Kaguya. The soft rustle of skin across his chest drew his attention. A small smile plucked at the corners of her face. Then it is a good dream. Fair enough. Surely it must be, because he couldn't recall the rabbit goddess ever doing something like this when he was awake. While he remained clad in his battered uniform often worn even during his house arrest, she wasn't clad in anything at all. Her long, flowing hair served to conceal several choice bits from view, but the fact remained that she'd essentially mounted him in her birthday suit. Judging by the impish grin she wore, he suspected this was a deliberate act on her part, one that promised him no end of a migraine. Spirits, what was she up to this time? Nothing good, he suspected. Why were you naked? A coy smile dimpled her cheeks. I thought young men liked such things. Not saying I don't, the time traveler groused, but I wasn't expecting this. Ah, she purred sensually, but the best things in life happen unexpectedly, wouldn't you agree? Wait, did you knock me out? When her smile only deepened, his frustration in more ways than one peaked further still. You did, didn't you? Sharp horns poked playfully against his forehead. I neither admit nor deny anything. Not fair. Not at all. Tough. In response his unlikely ally leaned forward, crushing her substantial bosom against his chest. Naruto stiffened. More so when she laid her forehead against his. Unwittingly his arms chose that moment to betray him, rising to encircle her waist. Pleased by what she no doubt saw as a total victory for herself, the pale deity nuzzled her nose into his cheek, thereby causing him to inhale sharply as the fresh fragrance of her body sidled up against his senses once more. Then she began to lay a series of soft delicate kisses against his neck, trailing playfully with each passing moment. Gods, that's just not fair. Why? Does this displease you? I don't remember you being quite this, forward. He ground out. Pale palms pressed against his back, easing him upright. Then you remember very little about me. Her lips sought his, momentarily obliterating all thought as their mouths molded marvelously together before she came up for air. I'm a fragment of a goddess, or have you forgotten? Restraint is simply not in my nature. Her words dissolved into a startled yelp as Naruto abruptly scissored his legs beneath them, threw his body to the side and rolled with her still in his arms. A flicker of wild surprise flitted across that pale visage as gravity seized her in its claws, as she quite suddenly found herself pinned beneath the very prey she'd sought to claim for herself. A curtain of ash splayed out behind her back as she instinctively clung to his neck, eyes wide. In that moment, with her guard down, Naruto almost faltered. He'd never seen Kaguya vulnerable before. Here, in this moment, all her plots and facades were stripped bare as her body. Traitorous eyes flitted downward before he could think to countermand them. A lone arm slithered away from his neck to conceal her extremities. Don't stare. Kaguya murmured. It's embarrassing. Then sense reasserted itself with a jolt and he realized he'd played right into her hand. Worse, he'd probably done the one thing he shouldn't have. Kaguya might have been content to tease him before, but now he'd gone and accidentally provoked her. Her, of all people. Triumph roared high in those pale crescent orbs, wilder than ever before. There was something more to it this time though, a hunger that genuinely frightened him. Not the fear of death, but the fear that, for once, he'd pushed her too far. Oh. Belatedly, he realized his mistake. I fucked up. Oh, well done. She growled. You actually made me blush. I believe you deserve a reward. Don't suppose I can opt out? The weary shinobi replied. Again that glimmer of madness. No. With a groan she surged upright and crushed her mouth against his. Theirs was not a gentle coupling, they took from one another roughly, shearing clothes away, rutting with all the grace of wild animals. She felt warm to the touch, amazingly solid in spite of his quivering hands, mewling under his grasp. White fingers drew bloody lines against his back and over his torso, tormenting old injuries he'd all but forgotten about. Pain. Pleasure. She wasn't gentle, but neither was he, yet her presence soothed the pain enough for him to breathe. To feel. To think again, if only in some limited capacity. If this were a hallucination, a dream, he wasn't sure he wanted to wake from it. He longed to close his eyes and drift away, but the forces that tethered him in place simply wouldn't allow it. Though the strain showed on Kaguya's face, she didn't release him. No, she only held him closer, one hand pushing against the scarred plane of his chest for leverage as she held the other, allowing him to admire the gentle sway of her body as she rode him on unto sweet oblivion and beyond. So. Why the sudden interest in me? He pressed some time later. Silly boy. She sighed, rocking gently against him, caressing his whiskered visage with a clawed hand. You were always mine. From the moment that Shinigami plucked you from death's door and thrust you into this life, I chose you. When you threw away your humanity for the sake of others, I chose you. When you chose to face your sins and conquer them, I chose you. Now, I'm simply taking matters into my own hands. Dark eyes narrowed. And this has nothing to do with my mood. Leaning back, she regarded him for a long, silent moment. I admit, your pain does displease me. How long are you going to sulk like this? By rights it was a simple question with a simple answer, yet try as he might Naruto couldn't bring himself to answer it. He knew how he must appear to anyone gazing upon him, after all, he hadn't eaten or slept in the last 2 days. It wasn't that he didn't want to, rather, he couldn't. When he closed his eyes he saw their faces. On the rare occasion that he didn't, Kuratsuchi's cries served as a poignant reminder of his sins. A legion of dead, murdered in his name. An endless host of bodies who would never again know had long since lost its taste for him. Hope turned to bitter ash in his mouth. His face bore the beginnings of a telltale stubble, one he really ought to shave, yet he simply couldn't bring himself to do so. It wasn't even apathy on his part. He simply felt hollow. At the time he'd thought he'd mastered his guilt. He was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. It was one thing to discuss matters of mortality with a disembodied deity on the road, another to face the fearful scorn of an entire village. To see them shy away from him, witness the terror rounding their eyes whenever he was near. Some respected him of course, but what little goodwill he'd managed to muster had been largely erased by his actions in IWA. It would take weeks, months, years to build it back up again. Apparently Kaguya had enough of his mindless grief. To the point of staging an intervention. Humbling, that thought. Until I've gotten my priorities in order. He managed at last, glowering down at his companion. Or until you betray me. Whichever comes first. Perished the thought. Her pale face dimpled in a slight, predatory smile. But you're not telling the truth. Come. Her expression softened and a hand descended, taking his in her own, guiding him to her. Talk to me. Tell me what ails you. It tumbled out of him before he could think to hold it back. Madara. Her gaze tightened. You would mourn for that imbecile. No. He snarled and it drew a startled flinch from Kaguya. Slowly, gingerly, she pulled herself away from him, heedless of the growl it drew. Speak, then. She cooed at him. I'm the only one who can truly understand you. Hardened eyes leered at her and for a nanosecond the rabbit goddess feared she'd pushed too hard. I doubt that. Yet he didn't challenge her, and so she waited in stoic silence for him to continue speaking. do I not? She retorted in a rare fit of pique. I know you, Naruto. An Uchiha you are not. You're merely masquerading as one with the Reaper's gift. In body perhaps, but your soul. No. You pretend to be something someone you are not, and for what? A distant dream? Peace. To avenge yourself on the man who took everything from you. She wasn't prepared for the laughter. Sharp, jagged, cutting like a knife against her confidence. You think you know me? Dull eyes gazed back at her, deceptively blank. That's cute. Silence reigned in the void. Sometimes, I forget what I used to be. Who? Naruto muttered, hiding his face in his palms. I was better than this, you know. When this started, I had principles. There were lines I wouldn't cross. Extremes I refused to go to. Until I did. I killed them. Like I did that village. Not just the men, but the women and the children, and knowing once I was not this thing. Dark eyes snapped into scarlet fury and crimson horns burst from his head, his voice warping painfully against the rage mingling with chakra in his throat even as his eyes blazed with unholy flame. This fucking thing. He roared at her and she accepted his anger stoically, even as her body recoiled and the dream world trembled. This monster. Him. I'm becoming more like him every day. White eyes so much like her own, rooted her where she stood, in the face of his rage. Look at me, Kaguya. Look at me. I used to be better than this. I used to be human. He seized her by the throat. Kaguya thought she knew pain, but this was hell. Will you kill me too, then? She challenged. In cold blood, with aggravating slowness, those clawed fingers fled from her windpipe. Gently, she reached for him, cupped his face, held it against her ample chest. Shoo, she breathed against the tattered mane of his hair, hush now. Come here. With a supreme effort of will, the former blonde mastered himself, white faded back to black, then, for a fleeting sliver of a second, the faintest shade of blue. Human. Right. Funny how that word's lost its meaning these days. Those haunted orbs rose to meet hers and for a moment, just a moment, the goddess felt a flicker of pity. I'm changing. Into what, I'm not sure. Whatever it is, I won't let it stop me. And what will you do about it? The goddess graced him with a beatific smile. What I must, he swore to her. I won't slip like this again. I won't. I can't. I'll kill Madara. I'll find him, and I'll kill him. I swear it. A fist rose, fingers grinding painfully against one another. Then everything will return to normal. Then it'll end. It has to. This poor boy. Did he truly think that way? Do you honestly believe that? Naruto grit his teeth, but he didn't challenge her on that point. That suited Kaguya just fine. He wouldn't be an ideal mate if he simply caved to her without cause. Nor did she want to break him, even. She wanted someone who would fight as much as fuck, a warrior without compare. Someone who stood strong in the face of adversity, one who would face their doubts and conquer them. After all, that would make their physical meeting all the more pleasing when they finally met in the flesh. Then she wouldn't have to settle for dreams, for this facsimile. Then he would be hers in body and soul. Then she might know some measure of peace, if not happiness. Soon. Idly, her gaze turned distant. Ah. You have a visitor. I suppose I should release you, for now. Red eyes bulged. Don't you fucking blue ball me. That startling grin was the last he saw of her. In a roar of sound she, and the dream with her, dissolved. With a start, Naruto felt his eyes burst open and the waking world returned. All at once his surroundings returned to him, the compound and its four walls, the porch upon which he sat, the fading light of day. Belatedly he realized he'd been sitting here, watching the sunset. Alone. Why? His mind conjured the memory readily when he tried to recall. He'd asked to be alone and thus was given his space. He trusted in Pakura to take care of little Kuratsuchi and the others, even if Mikoto was somewhat sullen about it. The rest would understand, eventually. He simply needed time to think. To be sure the path he'd chosen was the right one. And yet despite all this, or perhaps in spite of it, he had a visitor. Turning his gaze outward, he found a familiar face. There, waiting for him at his back. Well, you look like shit. Despite his best efforts to quell his rising temper, a muscle still jumped in Naruto's jaw at the sly retort, 3 veins pulsing in forehead alongside it. Naturally his first instinct was to lash out at the shadow in his door, to leap up off the porch and swipe that smug smile right off her face. It spoke volumes of his control that he merely snatched up a nearby tatami pillow and flung it in her direction instead. With skill expected of one such as them, the newcomer effortlessly batted the offending missile aside with a flick of the wrist. Hey, no need to get rough. TCH, bite me, Tsunade. The blonde grinned. Don't tempt me, kid. Spirits, she wasn't going to leave him alone, was she? Why the hell are you here? Wanted to check in on you. Mikoto said you weren't eating. Even as he opened his mouth to refute her, the Sannin crossed the yard to join him on the patio. Despite his own internal war, Naruto caught himself making room for her, allowing her to plop down on the worn wood beside him. That pointed gaze found his, demanding an answer. One might think she wouldn't be as intimidating in civilian clothes. One would be wrong. Even in her trademark red/white dress, she still projected that same aura of determination. In his anger, Naruto made the mistake of dismissing it. She worries too much. OW. 5 taut fingers crashed into his head in a harsh chop, drawing a yelp. Cringing, he clutched at the rising welt upon his skull. Hell was that for? For being an idiot. The blonde snorted, shaking her hair with a toss of the head. Seriously, what were you thinking? Half the village wants to exile you, the other half's worshipping the ground you walk on. If I didn't know better I'd say you were trying to start a civil war or something. Are you insane? I made a mistake. Understatement of the century, right there. I was an idiot. He sighed. It won't happen again. Good. Naruto choked. What do you mean, good? In that moment the light caught her eyes just so. Those hazel orbs narrowed upon him, half-lidded with intent. Exactly what I said. She purred, offering him a slight smile. That earnest look suits you. Irk. Gah. No. Bad Naruto. Down. Despite his best efforts, Naruto felt his heart lurch painfully. For all his attempts to ignore her less than subtle flirtations, one couldn't deny Tsunade's beauty. She was gorgeous. In her prime no less. Age and bitter cynicism had yet to exact their toll upon her, and if he had his say, the latter never would. Once, in another life one long since lost to him by the ravages of time, an iron wall of age and immaturity prevented him from noticing such a thing. As a boy she'd always been known as grandma to him, just as he was a brat to her at worst. Their relation had always been informal, downright familial even. He'd never lent credence to such thoughts, never considered the possibility of something more. Now, he almost considered her a friend. They'd fought together, bled together, and yet, gentle yet firm fingers danced across the exposed plane of his arm, jolting him. So you fucked up. The bluntness of her reply earned the Sannin a startled look. We all do. Granted, she amended with a grimace, yours might have been a bit more spectacular than most, but at least you're not acting like some mustache-twirling villain. You just need to do better. Mwahahaha. Naruto groaned half-heartedly into his palms. You're not helping. At all, see? She ribbed him with an elbow. There it is. You feel guilt. It's eating you up inside. Speaking of which, have you been eating? His back stiffened at the implications. Yes. Don't lie to me. I swear, I really have. Wow. Her fingers tightened upon his bicep explosively, drawing a pained burst that sent the Uchiha flailing about on the floor. Alright. Give. I haven't eaten in 2 days. You're gonna break my arm. I need that. What you need is a good meal. To his dismay, Tsunade burst upright, dragging him with her. Come on. We're going out. I'm under house arrest, remember. This is a terrible idea. Bad idea. It'll be fine. She snapped. Now stop dragging your feet and man up. I do not consent to this. Naruto squawked. I need an adult. A cheery grin flashed over the blonde's armored shoulder. Really, he should have expected her reply. You are an adult. Chapter 19, Shadows Closing In. There you go. That's the way. Drink up. Naruto nearly choked on said drink when Tsunade's hand slapped against his back. It was like getting hit by a ton of bricks. The impact alone threatened to launch him out of his chair and the bar altogether, only a healthy application of chakra kept him glued to his seat. He shot her a baleful glare, only to be met by a cheeky grin and rosy cheeks. As he looked on, she knocked another bottle back. With a reluctant sigh, the former blonde did the same, wincing as the booze burned the back of his throat. To be fair, he'd forgotten many things since he'd arrived in the past. This? Definitely one of them. Tsunade was a freakin' heavyweight when it came to drink. She'd had 5 bottles to his 2 now, and while he'd carefully nursed his drinks with the reluctance of someone who rarely partook, the legendary sucker, as she would one day come to be known in a far-flung that wouldn't happen now, downed hers with a ferocious fervor. She'd attacked each bottle as though it were her arch-nemesis. Somehow, she was still conscious. Really, it wasn't fair. He'd hardly drunk anything and he was already beginning to feel a bit tipsy. I swear, all that drink goes straight to your tits. Naruto groused. That earned him another slap on the back. This one proved less gentle than the last. Ha! I felt that one. Naruto laughed despite the pain that blossomed in his shoulder. No doubt he'd have a bruise tomorrow. What else you got? Tsunade's arm swung back and for a fleeting moment, he thought she might actually punch him this time. She settled for a laugh and shove instead. Gods, you're such an ass. Nope. He declared with a resounding smack of the lips. Oi. You can't just nope your way out of this. Nope. His grin grew a fraction. Cheeky little sure. Nope. Tsunade scoffed and swatted him on the arm. See? You can unwind when you want to. Just takes a bit of sake. Her sudden change of tune drew a frown from Naruto, made him wonder if she'd intended this from the start. Maybe he drank too much after all. In all honesty, Naruto couldn't remember the last time he'd done this. Just sat and relaxed with a friend. Oh, how his younger self would have balked at this. Then again, his former self would have chewed him out by now, too. He'd have every right to. He felt like a fake. A fraud. Everything he'd ever spoken against. Granted, he was fraud who'd gone father to Itachi Uchiha in this timeline, but a fraud nonetheless. Would he ever be able to tell anyone the truth? Would they even believe him? Or was he doomed to hold to silence? If that meant taking the secret to his grave, he wasn't sure he could, knowing everyone thought he was someone he wasn't. Naruto stole a glance at Tsunade as she knocked back her drink and called for another round, allowing them to drink in companionable silence. In his last life Tsunade had been his superior and the 5th Hokage. She'd been older. Tired. Worn away by the horrors of war. Not this grinning girl pressing a fresh bottle into his hand. Looking back on those halcyon days left him a little nostalgic. Things were different here. Here, they'd found and bled together on many a battlefield, forged through fire and flame. Here, in this lifetime, she was his friend. Something more. Even after all of this time he wasn't sure what to make of her. Theirs was a bond not so easily broken and yet sometimes it felt brittle all the same. As if a strong blow might snap it beyond repair. The truth would do all that and more. It's too late for the truth now, Naruto. You're in too deep. Kaguya reminded him. Would it really? Not for the first time, he wondered if he should tell her, speak the words he'd been longing to say. What truth? His guest whispered in the back of his head. That you're a fake. A fraud? A time traveler? She'll never believe you. I know. He retorted, grimacing on the inside. Doesn't make this any less painful. I've done things I'm not proud of. It's starting to make a monster of me. Does a monster feel guilt, Naruto? Does a monster experience regret? He could just imagine the fragment of a goddess shaking her head at him. Everything you have done thus far, you've done for the sake of peace. Even if you won't admit it, you've done good. You've saved lives. Orochimaru will never fall to darkness now. Pain and the Akatsuki shan't exist thanks to your actions, and because of that, Jiraiya will live as well. She paused, waited for him to challenge her, and when he didn't, barreled on. The Uchiha will not fall to foolishness and treachery. To say nothing of those you've helped along the way. I've screwed up, too. There are still other problems. A fit of melancholy overtook him as he took on another bottle. Danzo, Hidden Cloud, the mess I made with Minato, the other Bijou, Madara. Then we will crush those problems. She declared primly. Together. Just like that. Something in her words almost made him chuckle. It was a bitter one. Just like that. He heard the smile in her words. We'll avenge the past, Naruto. You have my word. Gonna hold you to that. He muttered into his drink, the words muffled by the bottle. It wasn't like he took any pleasure in deceiving his friends, so. An elbow caused him to turn his attention back to Tsunade. He found her smile waiting for him there. How are things? Loud. He yawned. Kuratsuchi's settling in and Itachi's finally found his voice. Not to mention Konan and the runts. Everyone's fawning over them. When that wasn't enough to satisfy her, he rested his chin against one hand and blew out a sigh. Honestly? I've got my hands full. Even with the girls helping. But it's worth it, heh. That drew a chuckle from her. You're a soft touch. Just one big, softy, bah. He batted her hand away and laughed when she swayed in her seat. And you're drunk. She turned up her nose at him, but there could be no denying her sly, smug smile. You can't prove anything. Now who's being cheeky? Why'd you go through all this today, anyway? He asked. It couldn't have been just for my sake, honestly. The faintest flush colored her pale visage for a fleeting moment before concern chased it away. I was hoping you had some news about Nawaki. She took a fingernail between her teeth and chewed it absently for a moment before continuing. He should have returned from his mission by now. She poked his chest for emphasis. But no one's heard from him. I asked the old man and he told me to ask you. Her eyes narrowed and the questing finger against his chest poked harder. Did you send them out again or something? All the blood in Naruto veins turned to sharp, jagged ice and an alarm roared to life in the back of his head. Looking back, he couldn't explain what made him suspicious in that moment, only that it did. What are you talking about? A distant bell swallowed whatever Tsunade might have said. We've got wounded at the gates. Naruto bolted upright. 0.0.0.0. You won't break me. An open palm cracked across Kushina's face with explosive force, but she didn't cry out. On the contrary, the young Uzumaki merely lifted her chin in quiet defiance with a selfsame smile. Another blow struck her, and yet again, she refused to give them the satisfaction of her pain. She wrote out the second same as the first, only smirking in the face of it. We shall see. An irritated growl greeted her as her captor paced away. It was a weak, throaty sound, the aching rasp of a man well past his prime. Kushina watched him like a hawk, willing herself to memorize every facet of him. It would be useful knowledge when she escaped. All told, he wasn't much to look at. He, for this one was certainly of the male persuasion, moved with a limp and favored his right leg when he walked, but his dark robes gave precious little away. His gray hair and wizened arms told another story, however. Whomever he was or might be, her captor was not a young man. His mask told her another. It was a strange thing, warped and spiraled like some kind of crest, with only a single eye hole to speak of. Oddly enough, the thought gave her comfort. An old man in a mask. One who refused to come near, knowing full well what she was capable of. Kushina wasn't afraid of him, not when it became apparent that he feared her. She'd seen far more terrifying things in her nightmares. It also begged another question. How long had she been held here? Days? Weeks? Time got funny in the dark, and here in this underground labyrinth she had no way of telling time. She'd woken alone ages ago to find herself imprisoned by great lengths chains, hands shackled uselessly against her back, legs bound to the floor to prevent any semblance of movement. That alone should have terrified her. But it didn't. If she was alone, that meant her teammates might still be alive. If they were alive, they could report back to the village. And if one of them managed that, he isn't what you think he is. The masked man told her. He's a fake. A fraud. Kushina turned her head and spat a bloody glob at their feet. Then he's my fraud, dumbass. She bared her teeth at him. And he'll come for me. The masked man tilted his head and tittered softly. Kushina had the distinct impression he was smiling behind the mask. Of course he will, my dear. A wizened hand reached up, painstakingly prying the facade from his face. I'm counting on it. Naruto's never been one to leave an ally behind. He's weak. Soft. Even when he's pretending to be something he isn't. When she leaned forward and tried to catch a glimpse of their identity, they stepped back into the shadows with a soft chuckle. Don't worry. I'm not going to kill you. It would serve no purpose, and you've already proven that you can't be controlled for long. Then why capture me at all? She snapped her teeth at him, eyes burning red. You know you can't hold me forever. What are you going to do? The laughter, when it came, surprised her. Something that should have been done a long time ago. I'm going to tell you the truth. Pearly white teeth grinned at her in the black when she tilted her head in confusion. The truth will set you free. The truth will destroy you, and him, more than anything I could ever hope to do. Why you're lying. A thorn of fear pricked at her heart. Lies. The truth will set you free. Her captor repeated. See for yourself. Kushina had half an instant to see burning Sharingan eyes before her vision went black. That's it for this part. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.